Okay, so historical materialism. Historical materialism is one of the most controversial issues in Marxism, actually. And there are some very good reasons for this. One of them is this idea of the tension between freedom and necessity. You know, this picture of the human history have been criticized as being a kind of deterministic, even technologically determinist account of history. You know, in this account, there's no sufficient role for human consciousness. And also the importance of technology was exaggerated to a great extent, according to this, especially this last thesis, the third thesis. You know, at a certain stage of development, the material forces of production coming to conflict with the existing relations of production, then comes the social revolution, etc. So you can see the human history as, you know, development of the forces of production. For example, technology is very important for human history, says Marx, even in his earlier works in the Poverty of Philosophy, I guess. He says something like this, you know, I don't know, steam engine gave rise the mode of production as capitalism. Even before this, wind power started feudalism, etc. So the emergence of each mode of production in the history of humankind can be identified with some technological changes or technological revolutions. You know, slavery collapsed because of the emergence of some mechanical inventions, such as there's this guy, actually, maybe you have seen his work in your economic history classes, Lynn White Jr. And he argued that the rise of the feudal society in the Middle Ages made possible by three important inventions. One was the heavy plow, heavy iron plow, because this was instrumental in increasing agricultural production. The plow that was used before the heavy iron plow, it was introduced in Europe in the Middle Ages, and people used some wooden plows which cannot dig the soil in a very good manner. So the use of this light wooden plow, whatever, you know, that agricultural instrument that is used to dig the soil, basically. And the material production of agricultural goods was very low. The average productivity in agricultural sector was very low. So introduction of this heavy iron plow used with horse, basically, created an increase in the productivity and, of course, the average production in the agricultural sector. So this was very important in the rise in the emergence of a new society. And also, since feudal society was a military society, so to speak, you know, that knights and warriors and whatever the King Arthur tales think. And the introduction of the stirrup, you know, it is very instrumental to steer horse, basically, stirrup, was very important in the creation of a society that is organized along military lines, basically. This is his idea, you know, this stirrup was invented by the ours, the Turks maybe, in the 5th or 6th century, but in the late 17th century and so forth, it came to Europe, and this was very good. And feudalism is said to start like, the end of Rome was 476, 5th century, starting from the 6th and 7th centuries. You can talk about the emergence of feudal society in Europe, basically. So introduction of the stirrup was very important in mounting of the knight on the horse, of course, and also it was instrumental to steer the horse so that the knight can fight in a better way on the horse, of course. So this was instrumental in the establishment of feudal society. And also there was another invention that Lin White talks about, which was I forgot the name again. Anyway, I can find it sometimes and show this. And this particular invention was a simple device, actually, leverage. Maybe it's sometimes something like this. In fixing tires, for example, we use this particular instrument. Well, I never use it, but yeah, some people do this. What was its name? Well, anyway, forget that thing. And it was important in building, for example, catapults. A catapult is an important weapon, which was very useful in sieges of castles and cities, etc. So it introduces some inventions in the military technology. And it was also instrumental in building astronomical mechanical clocks. Mechanical clock is important, the inventions in the mechanics created some new inventions in, again, the military technology, and also mechanical clock as the representation of as the model of the universe, so to speak. Even in the Middle Ages, the idea of the universe resembling a clock or some mechanical system or a device started to develop. Of course, the modern science is based upon this kind of understanding, so it has some interesting impacts on the evolution of human beings in general, not only in material terms, but also in some ideal terms, as in science, etc. So another invention was the same invention. Again, I forgot its name. My God. And was the production of windmills. Yes, this is right. Windmills was important in increasing, again, agricultural production. There is this windmill there's this, the wings of the mill, they rotate and they make the big stone down there to rotate as well. So flour is being produced in the windmill, so it also increased the production. So these three technological inventions were important: the stirrup, the heavy iron plug, and the last thing that I forgot its name. Anyway, so the emergence of feudal society can be explained with some important technological changes, and also same thing applies to the emergence of capitalism. And in capitalism, again, the rise of the machine in general, some technological inventions in the agricultural sector first, and then textile industry, in the railways, etc., etc. So capitalism starts with in the most developed form, of course, industrial capitalism, or we should say, industrial capitalism started with these kind of technological inventions. So technology is very important, if not the most important, force driving society or human history. This is a technologically determinist reading of history. Many people argue that because there's no place once again, for human intervention, human thinking, human consciousness. But it's debatable mostly. Think about, for example, technology. Again, what we call technology is more or less the product of the development of science in general, right? This is true not only for the modern science, starting with the 18th century, but also the earlier, even ancient science, maybe. It may not be called as science, but still it's a kind of a science in its own right. So basically, science is part and parcel of consciousness, right? In order for us to have any kind of scientific endeavor, we must think, we must use our own reason. So thinking may be important in the development of technology, which in turn affects the development of society, and the development of society may be influential in changing science again. So there's a certain and continuous interaction between technology and society, but not only technology and society, but also between thinking and technology, right? So thinking is important. We say that, Marxists usually say that social superstructure is about human consciousness, and human consciousness is a product of material forces and their relations, or the economic base in general. So you cannot reduce consciousness into the forms of consciousness would emerge on the basis of economic base. But there's the other half of the story again. Sometimes, and even most of the time, maybe the forms of consciousness, theories, ideas, ideologies even, may be influential, and generally are influential in bringing about some changes in the society, some changes in the production process, some changes in material development of the society in general, because human thinking and reasoning is influential, is important in explaining the course of history. Of course, we are not saying that, everything depends on thinking and reasoning, but the relationship between the material base or economic base and the superstructure is not a one-way relationship, but there are always continuous interactions between these two levels, the level of the economic base and the superstructure. So superstructure may also become important. And Marx would not reject this, because there are times at which Marx also argues that, I have never said that this is the theory for some marche générale of history. It's only a kind of first step at looking at history. If you want to understand historical changes and etc., you should consider the material base, both the relations of production and property relations, more or less, and the material basis, technology, the resources that are used in the production process, etc. But this never prevents forms of consciousness from affecting society or the material forces. Again, this is a two-way relationship. Base affects the superstructure, and there are times at which superstructure also affects the base. But, Althusser, an important Marxist, in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, calls this as a kind of the last instance. He is famous with this expression. He says, in the last instance, material base or economic base determines the social superstructure. But he also adds that something like this: the lonely hour of the economic base never comes. His idea is overdetermination, this constant in terms of causal relations between base and the superstructure. We have overdeterminations. There are many forces affecting the society. There are some forms of consciousness, also science, and also art, maybe. Traditions, the ideology of the society may have some influence on the material forces of production and relations of production. And also material base also affects the superstructure. So there are many variables, so to speak, that affect each other. So out of these constant and complex interactions, the net result may never be known. This is the idea, that the lonely hour of the base never comes. So in the last instance, at the end of the day, maybe, economic base is important. And if you especially want to understand social change, you may consider the tensions and struggles and contradictions between the forces of production and material relations of production within the economic base. But still, the relationship between base and superstructure is very complex one, so that the result can never be predicted. So everything that could happen. So Marx has some interesting comments about this, especially towards the end of his life. So this is an important debate still, but I think one of the most interesting aspects of this debate is the role of human consciousness and human free will. So within Marxism in general, some people reject completely the importance of free will, and they argue that whatever happens in the Hegelian fashion, in the reality, must occur by necessity. Everything that occurs is necessary, in the sense that there is no other way for them to occur. That was the idea. If you look at human history, there's a constant change in the history in terms of historical stages or phases. We start from primitive communism, then came slavery, then feudal society, and later capitalism, and the history will not end with capitalism. Of course, there will be socialism and communism as the latest stage. Communism represents the end of history in this sense. But from another angle, it's the starting of a new phase in human history, real human history, as Marx would calls it, actually. So, but there's also another criticism directed to this representation of this historical change, which is that this idea, this account for historical change, can be applied to European history only. Other parts of the world cannot be explained on the basis of this simple scheme. There is, for example, in the Turkish economic history, an important controversy regarding the applicability of this historical materialism to historical change in Turkish society, in the Ottoman period. One of the questions is this: can the Ottoman Empire be seen as a kind of feudal society, or is it different? So, in other words, if you accept that Ottoman society is not a feudal society because of the utmost importance of the state and the power of the state in general, because if you look at European history, there's not a very powerful center or a state that could control all of the society. There are kings and lords and other kinds of people governing societies, but these are feudal society is a kind of fragmented society. There are many seats of powers. Even the king himself or queen herself is not that powerful to change or to affect the behavior of the lords. The relationship between the lords and the king is a kind of relationship among equals. The king is the first among equals, but the lords usually don't listen to the king. So the rise in the power, political power of the king starts in the early modern period, with the rise of the nation states, first in England and France. So basically, the feudal society can be characterized as the lack of one single all-powerful center from a political angle, of course. But in the Ottoman society, the Sultan is the most important and most powerful authority that is supposed to govern the society as a whole. So many people believe that the Ottoman society is not a feudal society, but there are also some other counter-arguments, in the Ottoman economic history class, if it still exists, of course. You can see it or you can read it. Anyway, so this account of history can be applied to European history, and it does not have any kind of validity in explaining the history of the rest of the society, rest of the world. So this is another explanation, but still Marx's historical materialism is a kind of methodological principle. If you want to understand any kind of society, maybe even if not the first place, but one of the places that you should look at is this economic base. Economy is important. It's the economy, stupid, says some politicians in the United States. I forgot his name. Something like this. So this, especially tensions and struggles within the economic base, is also important. And so if you want to understand any society, you should consider the importance of the relations of production, property relations, and which express themselves as class struggle within the society, and also the effect, the influence of this economic base on the working of the political superstructure. But this does not mean to reject the importance of superstructure as being an explanatory principle in whatever happening within the economic base. So there are constant interactions and influences between the economic base and the superstructure. So this is a kind of methodological principle. So remember, we are talking about some 3-page long preface and 2 long paragraphs here, 3 theses. Economic base is important. It's materialist in the sense that independent of consciousness. And also economic change should be explained on the basis of the tensions and contradiction between the relations of production and forces of production, etc. So there are different interpretations about the working of this if you look at the history of Marxism itself. And there's one tradition, first tradition, diamond, it's called. Diamond is a simple expression for dialectical materialism, especially in the Soviet interpretation of Marx. Marx is important in inventing three important accounts for philosophy and history. Of course, one is the dialectical materialism, dialectic, the idea of dialectics. It's a very old tradition in the history of philosophy, but the most important philosopher associated with the idea of dialectics is again Hegel. Hegel says that there are contradictions. What's a contradiction? Contradiction is the violation of the principle of non-contradiction. Well, this is explanatory. I'm going to talk about this as well. So if something is both itself and not itself, it's a form of contradiction. Hegel argues that, for example, in his account of history, he says at the beginning we have this spirit. Spirit is a form of consciousness, but unfortunately it does not know anything about itself. It does not have any kind of self-consciousness. So it comes to be alienated to itself and it forms the material world. So whatever exists actually can be seen as both idea, both consciousness and matter. So this is a contradiction. Something should be either idea or form or spirit, whatever, or matter, right? According to the usual interpretation of the debate between idealism and materialism, but Hegel combines them in his own philosophy and argues that in the beginning we have this form of consciousness, but this form of consciousness actually creates matter. So it transforms itself into the matter, and throughout the material world there emerges human thinking, human reasoning, human beings, of course, and through human beings who are thinking about themselves, the spirit comes to think about itself and reach self-consciousness. So it starts with a state of form, a state of consciousness, then it becomes matter, and out of this material world, it emerges again a different, a more enlightened, so to speak, a richer form of consciousness, which is the end of the history, according to Hegel. So this is one idea. And this dialectical materialism, instead of idealism, in the interpretation of this diamond thing, instead of mind or form of consciousness or spirit, we can write matter, right? There's no such thing as matter or spirit, according to materialist interpretation. But even in the material world, we can see these kinds of contradiction. And even in society, we have this contradiction, like the contradiction between the relations of production and forces of production, basically. So again, history is full of contradictions, and these contradictions are the driving force for any change, both in the material world, in the world of existence, and in the society, in human history in general. So this is a kind of economic determinism, in the sense that economic base is the most important explanatory variable to explain a society, and also to explain the social change. And also it's a technological determinism, because behind these social changes are the technological changes. So basically, this is a kind of interpretation that gives little role to human active thinking and changing the society. So forms of consciousness are purely dependent upon material base. And with regard to capitalism, of course, their interpretation is that, we are going to talk about it, commodification of labor power, which is the distinguishing characteristic of capitalism, and capitalism creates absolute poverty, and this poverty will bring about social revolution, proletarian revolution, carried out by the proletariat, and socialism. Sometimes this perspective is called as automatic Marxism. Everything happens in the world and even in capitalism occurs in an automatic fashion without any kind of human interference, any kind of human intervention. But there's also another tradition which is sometimes called as Western Marxism. And in this tradition, human consciousness becomes much more important than in the diamond kind of interpretation of Marx. And this Western Marxism was started by two important figures in European philosophy. One is the Hungarian Marxist Georgi Lukács, and the other is German philosopher Karl Korsch. And this Western Marxism starts in the late 1920s and 1930s, at the time of Stalin, maybe, the 1920s, late 1920s and early 1930s. So again, a critique directed to this automatic or technological and economic determinist interpretation of Marx, and they emphasize the importance of young Marx, young in the sense that, his work when he was young. Until 1850s, among his works in this younger period was the doctoral dissertation I talk about, and later he wrote some pamphlets and books about philosophy and political economy, such as the 1844 manuscripts, which are very important to understand Marx, according to this Western Marxist tradition, and also some works with Engels until the German ideology, 1853, I guess. So beginning from the late 50s, Marx started to change, according to some, his views and placed greater emphasis upon the material basis, that importance of economic factors and so forth. So this Western Marxist guys places some importance on his philosophical ideas, Marxist philosophical ideas, which more or less emphasize the importance of human beings as directed to realize their own potentialities in the Aristotelian fashion, as we talked about, and we will be talking about these aspects of Marxist thought next week, I guess. And also regarding capitalism, this commodification of labor power, which represents the highest stage of alienation of human being, alienation of human beings towards their own humanity, themselves, their own society, etc. So alienation, fetishism, and there will be some tendencies for social breakdown. So these two traditions in general, of course, this Western Marxist tradition does not represent a single whole, single totality. There are many different philosophers that could be placed within this tradition, but there are constant controversies and debates over the importance of Marx's ideas within the Western Marxist tradition. The diamat with the end of the Soviet Union and existing socialism, we can say that diamat had come to an end. But still, in Turkey, maybe, there are many Marxists who would still defend this dialectical materialist interpretation of Marx, so to speak. There are also some other Western Marxist guys in history, but so maybe it's better for us to stop here, because if we start the idea, this Western Marxist thinking, or we are not going to talk about Western Marxist tradition in general, but we are going to talk about the work of the young Marx, especially his ideas of this species being self-realization, realization of potentialities, and alienation and so forth. But still, we can maybe talk about a little bit, talk about dialectics, the contradiction. Dialectics, as I said, is important in Hegel's thinking. And Hegel's philosophy can be seen as an example of the view that is known as becoming, philosophy of becoming. This is another important controversy within the Greek philosophy tradition between being and becoming. According to Plato, for example, everything that exists, that is real, is the world of forms, ideas, consciousness, idea, sometimes it's called. I don't know, it's forms, more. So there's no such thing. I mean, everything material is not real, actually. It's just an illusion, so to speak, or it's a kind of copy or embodiment of some kind of form, actually. If we are human beings, we are representatives of the human form. But unfortunately, each of us has this form, but we are just copies or embodiments, so to speak, of this form. So our aim should be to understand what this real form is. And to do so requires reasoning, thinking, because once we belong to this world of forms, so we can understand through our own reasoning the working of this form. And within the world of forms, everything is perfect. And if something is perfect, there's no reason for this thing to change, right? If I'm perfect, there's nothing left to change and make myself better, for example, etc. So the world of forms is also the idea of perfection. Everything that exists in the world of forms is also perfect. It means that there's no such thing as change. This is a philosophy that is older than Plato, actually. There is this famous debate between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Heraclitus is famous for his phrase, you cannot swim in the same river twice, because at different times you enter into this river, but the water has flown and the river is the new one. So change is a constant aspect of the reality. So he believes in change. This idea is known as the philosophy of becoming. But Parmenides rejects this idea, Parmenides and Zeno after him. Zeno is famous, for example, for his paradoxes. One paradox is Achilles and the turtle. And the other is the arrow paradox and so forth. These paradoxes are meant to show that the notion of change is nothing but an illusion. There's no such thing as change. It's just a kind of self-deception even. So Plato also believes in that, because in the world of forms, we have this perfect world and there's no change. So if we are seeking to reach the knowledge of the reality itself, the real reality, so to speak, we have to consider this world of forms, right? But in Aristotle, for example, each being, including human beings, are to be represented with the union of both form and material existence. We have our bodies, but we have some potentials to be realized as the definition, so to speak, of ourselves. A form is simply the definition, very simply, a definition of a thing. I'm a human being, so what I call human essence or human nature is simply definition of a human being. So as a member of the human species, I have this form within myself. So the world of forms is not different from the world of material existence, according to Aristotle, It is the one and the same word. In the word, we have material forms, material beings, including human beings, but each being is to be defined by the form that is within this material existence. So I'm a human being. My material existence is to be defined by form, but this form is within myself. So it is to be defined by reference to the developmental potentialities in Aristotle. So my aim is to try to realize those potentialities. That is the basic idea. So in Aristotle and in materialism, sometimes there's this idea of becoming. So things, human beings included, are subject to change. So according to Aristotle, again, for example, under the moon, everything is subject to change, but above, over the moon, nothing changes. There's only one perfect form of movement, which is the circular movement. By the way, this is the principle behind the belief that planets have circular orbits. So this is the metaphysical aspects of Ptolemaic representation of the universe, or the mechanical, the planetary system. So in this world, in our world, everything is subject to change. Things change, and there's a movement, basically. But in the world of forms, or above the moon, according to Aristotle, there's no such thing as change, and there is perfect self-repeating movements, which is the most perfect form of movement, is the circular movement, basically. There's no starting point, there's no end point. It keeps running in a circular fashion, of course. So by over the moon, he means, the word of heavens, space, in our jargon. So basically, according to Aristotle, change is a constant aspect of the existence, like Heraclitus. And the same, interestingly, the same applies to Hegel, but Hegel argues that, he's a philosopher of, he's an idealist philosopher like Plato, but he also believes in change is a constant feature of the existing reality, and it applies to the spirit itself, spirit. All human history, or all natural history, is a history of the spirit to achieve self-consciousness. So there's constant change. When the spirit achieves its self-consciousness, the change will stop. So this is a very interesting philosophy at the same time. And at the basis of this philosophy is the idea of dialectics. Dialectics represents the moment, the rules of the moment of any kind of being, including the spirit itself. And it's based upon the notion of contradiction. So contradiction in the violation of Aristotelian principles, especially the third principle here. The first principle is the principle of identity, something. This something could be anything. It may be a kind of proposition, or a sentence, or a thinking, or a being, or an animal, or a human being, whatever, anything that exists as a mental state as well. So something is identical with itself, right? Yeah, sure. And something is different, second principle, from non itself. A is different from non-A. If I'm a human being, I cannot be at the same time, I don't know, a tree, maybe. So these two principles are important, but the third one is the most important, according to Aristotle. These are the rules of logic that applies to science in general. Either A or non-A, not both. This is called excluding the middle, or sometimes principle of non-contradiction. So contradiction is the violation of this last principle of non-contradiction. Both A and non-A at the same time can happen, can exist. In the Hegelian philosophy again, the spirit is both form of consciousness or a form simply, and a material thing, a matter, a form of a matter. So this is contradiction, and the whole change comes from this contradiction. Spirit in the beginning is a consciousness which does not have a self-consciousness. I keep repeating this because I like this, I like to say it, but I have no idea what it means actually. This is a form of contradiction. This is what I only know. Simple. Well, anyway, maybe you can understand what it means. Okay, so dialectics is important. Dialectic represents, this idea, this change between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis thing. Thesis is the spirit itself, antithesis is the matter, and the synthesis is the synthesis between idea and matter, so that spirit achieves self-consciousness, whatever. So this is the process, but behind this process is the notion of contradiction. Contradiction is the driving force of any change, according to Hegel. And this idea was transferred to Marxist thinking, and Marx also said some passages that seem to show that he also believes in this dialectics thing as a principle explaining both natural or historical changes, and also as a kind of methodology to be used in understanding the society and nature at the same time. Engels, for example, has this interesting book about the Dialectics of Nature, and he argues that dialectics is not only a method for thinking, for reasoning, but also it's the main principle that explains the change in nature itself. So dialectical materialist interpretation usually draws on Engels's interpretation in general, but still there are passages that show Marx also adheres to this view. So anyway, behind dialectical process is the notion of contradiction. For example, we mentioned the contradiction between within the economic base between forces of production and relations of production. So this is a kind of contradiction, and class contradiction is sometimes exemplified as an instance of contradiction, but there are some questions about the validity of this application of the notion of contradiction into the class struggle. And also, for example, Marx says something like this: one of the most important contradictions of capitalism is the contradiction between the level of development of the methods of production and the social relations. What he means by this, what he explains actually, this as capitalism usually revolutionizes methods of production. These days we call it inventions and creative destruction thing, Schumpeterian idea, and Marx also says this. This is an important aspect of capitalism. Even in Communist Manifesto, for example, he says everything that is solid melts into thin air under capitalism, which means that capitalism constantly revolutionizes production methods. And also these revolutions in the technology will bring about changes in the society as well, etc. That is the same idea. So basically, this is an important contradiction of capitalism. Production methods are changing in a rapid way, and also they are socialized. In other words, the interaction within the production process among individuals has increased to a much greater extent than they were in feudalism, for example. So, social character of capitalism or social character of production under capitalism has increased to a greater extent, but unfortunately, social relations, class relations, basically, controlling of the means of production by a smaller section of the society called bourgeoisie and so forth. So at one point, again, this contradiction between forces of production, methods of production, and relations of production will appear under capitalism, and this is represented by the class struggle, and this class struggle will be intensified until the revolution occurs, or at least there will be some tendencies for social unrest and social struggles, etc. So that was a kind of contradiction. So contradiction is important in Marx as well. So the source of any change is contradiction. Okay, next week we are going to talk about this notion of contradiction and dialectics maybe, but mostly about the human nature, or Marx's account of human nature, especially his ideas of alienation and contradictions within the human sphere and their importance in the Marxian thought in general. Okay, maybe we should stop here and